And our political commentators, and it's going to be a busy morning for them. Ben Thomas is with us. Morena, Ben.
Morena.
And in Auckland, Andrew Kirton. Kia ora, Andrew.
Kia ora, Catherine.
So Ben's a former National Party government press secretary, a columnist and a director of the public affairs firm Capital. Andrew Kirton was a speechwriter to former Prime Minister Helen Clark. He was then Labour Party General Secretary. He was campaign manager in 2017 for the general election. He also worked with Christopher Luxon in New Zealand, went back to the Beehive as Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Chris Hipkins in 2023 and is now Director at corporate affairs firm Richmond Bartley. He's also married to a current Labour MP. You win the biggest disclosure, Andrew.
Yeah, sorry about that. Running out of time for the actual show after that.
That's okay. Look, let's just quickly touch on that inflation, that CPI figure. It might come up a little bit later when we discuss some of the pressure that the Prime Minister is under at the moment. It's reached the 3%, the upper level of the Reserve Bank's target range. Just talking to our business editor who says the underlying inflation level is more like 2.5, and therefore that may be causing the Reserve Bank a little bit of comfort out of this latest number. Of course, its next OCR decision is later in November. But there's no doubt that an economic recovery is something the Prime Minister and his government is desperately looking for. Let's begin with someone else. Let's begin with Jim Bolger. Touch on his legacy. It's kind of interesting looking back to that 90s era. So much happening post the 80s reforms, then National carried them on, then the cup of tea came in its own way under Jim Bolger. But a lot of reflection on the size of the legacy, whether or not you liked it or didn't like it. We don't see that kind of legacy much these days, do we, Ben?
No, and I think it's probably, well, it certainly is no coincidence that the last two FPP governments, which was that Labour government and the first two terms of Bolger's national government, were much more reformist, much bolder, much more able to effect significant and lasting change than anything we've seen since MMP, and in large part that's because a big argument for MMP during Bolger's time in government was, to kind of, stop this sort of unilateralism and what was seen as kind of going against their word in campaigns of the two major parties. On the other hand, you can then look and see that, reflect on whether since the Bolger years we've had a period of stability, a period of calm, a period of prosperity. There's certainly been those things mixed in, or whether there has been something of a kind of a long-term decline, the sort of downward managing of New Zealand expectations, which is sort of really kind of coming to the fore now, I think, or chickens coming home to roost.
Okay, your take on the scale of the legacy, Andrew?
I think it's great that we're seeing these warm reflections of Jim Bolger's life. I think the National Party is rightly proud of one of their greatest leaders. I think it does say something about a couple of things. One, about experience. He was in Parliament 18 years before he became PM at the age of 55. And also, personal reflection. He was a Catholic from a dairy farm, for a farm in the King Country. I was a Catholic from a farm in the King Country as well, so I can kind of feel a sense of affinity with him in one sense. I think it's also a reminder that politics can be so fickle. They almost lost the 1993 election by 2 votes, 2 seats, and the legacy of the National Party from 1990 to 1993 was pretty controversial with the surtax and the Employment Contracts Act and the mother of all budgets. If they'd lost that, then who knows where the National Party would have been in the years following. And of course, 1996 was pretty close as well. Winston deciding after 2 months to go with Jim Bolger. So for me, it reflects just how fickle politics can be. You can be a feather duster or a rooster, and Jim Bolger was certainly a rooster. And we reflect back on those years as someone that actually had some conviction. To Ben's point, I guess choose your problem. You either have conviction politicians or you have MMP where the sharp edges are taken off, but these long-term persistent problems continue.
Interestingly, his strategy got involved in both of those situations. I think it was Peter Tapsell that he proposed, Labour's MP, that he proposed be Speaker, which of course gave him would have been a 1-seat buffer, and it became a 2-seat buffer. And, same in 1996 in the negotiations. Yes, it's fickle, but it's also not necessarily an accident who can prevail sometimes. There are limits on what you're prepared to do as well, and I know in those negotiations in particular there's been a lot of speculation as to what people were prepared to agree to and what they weren't. That point about MMP is a very valid one, isn't it, Ben? That ability to do really hard and really unpopular things. I think National got down to 22% under FPP in a poll. Bolger's popularity was down to 10%. Nobody's going to do that these days, are they?
I remember Guy and Espina's excellent Ninth Floor podcast or series for RNZ. I think Bolger said that he got into the single digits, and he said, no Prime Minister is ever going to beat that again, probably.
I think Helen Clark had a go at one point, but yeah.
I think that's right, is that, while everything in politics is contingent, the number of near misses that Jim Bolger managed to sort of navigate, while often being sort of derided by his opponents, criticised in the media and public,
yes,
as a bit of a sort of country bumpkin, but actually an extremely canny operator, an extremely thoughtful and smart politician, and
he reflected also in that Ninth Floor. He reflected himself, and he was prepared to say some things didn't work and we got some things wrong. And that, again, is something you wish you could hear more often. It also says something about the passage of time, as does the way people are talking about him. Because you're right, at the time, he was often derided, and he wasn't necessarily particularly popular often in his own party, let alone, more widely.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't have had Te Papa, because I don't think that was that popular within the National Party caucus. Certainly, they thought
wasn't with the finance minister.
The finance minister hated that with a passion. And I also think that if MMP came in 1993 instead of 1906, there might have been some trouble with the Tainui and Ngāi Tahu settlements as well, because there could have been other parties involved that weren't that keen on them. There certainly were National Party cabinet ministers who were wondering why the Prime Minister was so keen on those settlements. And that's really opened the floodgates for the process we've had since, which has been really positive. So
again, it's that compromise of MMP, and we're seeing it. We're going to talk about it in just a moment's time. That compromise, you're not only having to persuade and wrangle your own caucus, you're up against one or two partners with different views as well. I love the Te Papa quote. I don't know who sourced it, that apparently he said, when saying why he wanted the money spent on that, there's more to life than paying down debt. All right, let's have a look at the woes for National's current leader. A suite of polls coming in now. I think the one that's had a lot of attention, the post-Freshwater, might actually have shown a comfortable majority for the centre-right parties. But what's been so stark and so commented on is the National leader's own individual performance. How serious is this for him, Ben?
It's becoming more significant. It is becoming harder and harder. I think, as Luke Malpass said, I think his headline was, National's Christopher Luxon problem is becoming impossible to ignore, or something along those lines. And it is occupying much more of the narrative. This is not just a matter of, media sort of talking, and that kind of creates its own momentum, which you see a lot of in opposition, say, when there's troubles. This is consistently borne out by the polls that the Prime Minister is really failing to connect with a lot of even the centre-right's own voters. I think there was one question in that Freshwater poll, 49% of people thought there should be a change of Prime Minister. I thought a bit too much was extrapolated from that question. That's not a question that gets asked a lot. We don't really have a control for that. I don't think that's of much significance. On the other hand, there was polling which suggested that, up to a third of New Zealand First voters, the only party in the coalition that is actually surging in popularity, could be enticed back to National if there was a change of leader. And that does suggest that there is, an issue at the top. To Andrew's earlier point, none of this is very fair. But there is just something that is failing to connect. I mean, we sort of saw one of the kind of symptoms that I've identified earlier, which is this kind of disconnect between what how he's telling the story about the economy and what people are seeing, sometimes immediately afterwards. And we saw that, National probably were jumping the gun on sort of hailing the recovery for most of this year. Even this morning, Christopher Luxon on Morning Report saying, isn't it great that inflation is under 3%? You know, when talking about the teacher pay demands. And, you know, there's like 2 hours to wait, right?
It's like the charts. I recall one last week talking about the job seeker when on a Morning Report. And the question was, where are the jobs for all these young people? And he was talking about a 30-year average. This is the thing, isn't it, Andrew? You've got to be able to carry the story in a way that people receive. And is he learning? Is he learning that important skill?
Well, there's no evidence of that yet, but maybe that's still coming. I mean, I from my time at Air New Zealand with him, I thought he was excellent on the story. Everyone was extremely clear about where the airline was going. Sure, some parts of the airline were a bit grumpy with him from time to time, but I thought he was very good in that space, and that doesn't seem to have translated as much into government. They've got a clear consistency problem where they say they focus on growth one day and then they're mucking around with te reo on passports the next. They've got a priorities problem where they come in and give favourable treatment to tobacco companies and landlords, and that's and disestablished pay equity claims, and then that sets them up to every time they make a decision from then on, people are going to hark back to those priorities. And they've got a tone problem where they've got this hyper-aggressive approach towards the likes of 18 and 19-year-olds, getting them off the couch, saying they have to move back in with your parents, but also you have to move regions to pick apples. At the same time, and the only path to success is to secure another 5% from the left. I mean, they can't just keep stealing it from within ACT and New Zealand First and National, because they're just not enough. And so it's quite a curious approach to the way the government's political messaging is working at the moment. And I would have thought they would have taken a more sort of softer approach to try and attract some of those Labour voters across. Yeah,
and I think that in terms of capturing that centre vote, which is going to be crucial, every poll now is basically showing a toss-up on the day. The Freshwater poll, ironically, was probably the best poll for the government for quite some time. The sort of gratuitous, I think, actions, like, for instance, I've got a big interest in this. I worked on the Marine and Coastal Area Act when it was introduced. I have since worked with iwi and currently work with iwi who have claims under that Act, although I'm not involved in those. And which is, that's just me stating my bona fides for, I know that when the Prime Minister says we're restoring the original intention of this Act, I know that that's not true, right? But I think that kind of activity, the tumult around the Treaty Principles Bill, that's the sort of thing that I think is going to dissuade, some of those centrist voters, the sort of people who were swinging between Helen Clark, John Key, Jacinda Ardern, and then maybe a little bit kind of came home to Christopher Luxon last time, but not sort of in huge numbers. And National is in a very precarious position right now. Their average over the last few months is closer to 31 than it is to their election night result of 38. That's a lot of MPs to shed. And
that's another factor for internal dissatisfaction, is when you have some of your most senior people facing not getting back because they're list only. And if your party vote comes down and you keep the same number of electorate seats, there's not much on the list.
Yeah, that's right. And because Labour is, let's not forget, Christopher Hipkins is actually in a pretty similar spot. He's ahead as preferred Prime Minister marginally. Labour is marginally ahead of National. But his approval ratings in these polls that are coming out is actually dropping as well. There's a real race to the bottom in the two major parties right now.
What are you seeing going on, Andrew, with all this?
Well, I mean, Ben's right. The warning, Labour shouldn't be measuring the curtains for the beehive just yet, and neither are they doing anything like that. We've just been talking about Jim Bolger's legacy and Ben's point around Jim claiming the lowest approval ratings of any Prime Minister. So we've got to extrapolate that out a little bit and say that if the economy does actually turn around magically in the next 12 months, I think a lot of people will be coming on the show and others saying, oh, well, maybe he was right all along, he held his nerve, and now things are looking up and their poll is rebounded. So things can be a little bit fickle.
Is that the story he's telling, though? Is that the story he should be telling, instead of saying that for unemployment, if you look at the 30-year average, things aren't too bad? It's humanising. Or saying, isn't it great, inflation's under 3%? Well, it's better than when it was 6 or 7%. It's that ability to empathise and explain to the electorate that you get and feel their pain, but hang on, help is on the way.
Yeah, and if you look back, some of the best prime ministers New Zealand's ever had, that they've all had that unique skill of being able to be empathetic and relate to the average guy. John Key did it very well. Jacinda Ardern did it very well. Helen Clark taught herself to do it, etc. So I think there's a little bit of work to do there to try and bring people along. And not just repeat key lines ad nauseum until the interview is over. I mean, it gets you through a difficult interview repeating your key lines, but eventually it just sounds a little bit hollow. So I think there's a little bit of work to do there. The other impact that this will have will be on the worker bees inside the beehive and outside. When they're seeing their party struggling in the polls, it just means that you might just take your foot off the gas a little bit. It's hard to get people to work until 10 p.m. at night when things aren't going well, and that in itself can be compounding, because if you're not sort of being careful, you miss something, and then other mistakes happen. So I think for the staff in the beehive, those are tough jobs. But it's not helped by the fact that your poll ratings isn't going very well.
Let's look at what is happening on the possible alternative government side, and Te Pāti Māori's fracture continuing to deepen here. First, let's look at what that means for them, and then what it means also for a Labour Party that's just sort of sitting there trying to be as small a target as it can be at the moment, and we'll talk more about how much longer it can keep doing that. How serious what's happening within Te Pāti Māori? How much is simply this is the way we do things, and you can go and do all your your shady deals behind closed doors, but we're up front and
For Te Pāti Māori, this is bordering on existential. There's been some commentary that, look, they're not like other parties. They're not treated the same as by the media, although I think that's starting to change. They're not treated the same by their supporters. The expectations are different. They are more of an activist. I would call them largely a social media activism campaign with a parliamentary wing.
And so how much given that, and how much given the representation, they're standing up for their own people, including in disagreements within their own party, how much can you manage that and how much can't you?
No, and I think that's what makes this different from the other sort of, missteps that they've made, which their followers don't see as missteps, which is that this is a schism. We saw this in the original iteration of the Māori Party with Hone Harawira. That led to that ends up splitting. Then you're just dealing with maths. You're dealing with how many of their supporters will vote for one of the branches and how many will vote for the other, and that starts to make it much harder to hold on to electorates. And we saw that when Hone Harawira set up the Mana Party. If this turns into a full-on break between the parties, or between the party or within the party, this could have severe electoral consequences for them.
So Iru Kapakingi saying, I'm not interested in starting an alternative parties on record saying that. Do you believe that, or do you just believe that the risk is there's a drift of voters away from Te Pāti Māori, those who have been very involved in Toi Te Tiriti? What do you think's going on?
That's probably his intention right now. They may not start another party. There may just be Maria Meno Kapakingi standing as an independent in Te Tai Tokerau. Or there may be, Takuta Ferris standing as an independent in Te Tai Tonga. That would have the same, not as severe an impact, but I think it would still have a significant impact. I think people who have different ideas about how a kaupapa-based organisation should work, to how the leaders are currently conducting things, they may be turned off. They may go back to Labour. This is the biggest challenge that Te Pāti Māori has had so far in its reborn form.
Andrew, your take.
I'm torn on this, because on one level all parties have factions. I mean, in the Australian political system, factions are very well defined. You actually pay a sub to be a member of a particular faction if you're a member of a political party. In New Zealand it's not defined, but we get these moments where they're at play. There's factions within the National Party between town and country, between the Greens, environmentalism versus values, and Labour, left and right. And we're seeing some of that in the Māori Party. I think it will settle down. I think it's, if people think that political parties are harmonious all the time until conflict spills out into the public, it's not the case. There's conflict going on all the time. It's just that sometimes it happens to be in the public, and this is quite public. I think, to Ben's point, if there is some sort of split off, it will probably be in the sense of one person going off and being an independent as opposed to a major new force emerging. The best case is obviously for them and for the left is that it all seems to settle down. I was a bit bemused though that that government ministers jumped in immediately to try and put pressure on Labour to say you've got to rule out the Māori Party because they're going through this internal strife. Well, if that logic is to be followed, then New Zealand First and Act should have ruled out National after the Jamie Lee Ross saga. I mean, this is a bit silly. These parties go through all sorts of internal strife from time to time. It's bad. You get the popcorn out if you're an opponent, but things generally come together and you sort of move on.
I've got an alternative explanation for that, which was that it was not good faith advice or an inquiry, but an effort to put pressure on Labour where they are most vulnerable, I think with centre voters, which is fear of Te Pāti Māori. Te Pāti Māori was not popular. It was by far the least popular party overall in terms of net approval before this happened, and now they also look like a shambles who are turning in on themselves. So, that's just sensible from the government.
This issue of them being a kaupapa-based party, Andrew, which is what I was kind of getting at before, and we had Taku Te Whera saying this when his own leaders were apologising and he wasn't. He was almost saying, I don't answer to you, I answer to my people. Now, if that is the kaupapa, what on earth does it mean for how Labour can put together a governing arrangement that can sell to the electorate? What kind of arrangement does it need to be? Does it need to be Te Pāti Māori hopefully providing the necessary votes but not wanting to be in coalition? Or is Te Pāti Māori going to say, well, sorry, this government's forming, we want some key ministerial roles? At what point does that reach crunch point?
Yeah, it's far too early now. That decision needs to be made, probably 2 months out from an election in any real sense, and hopefully the kaupapa is sort of sorted by then. But if the election result delivers Labour and the Greens, 58 seats out of 61, and the Māori Party have 5 seats, then they're hardly going to take the country back to an election, given that their stated goal is for a one-term national government. And you may see them with concessions from a Labour Green government, or you could see a situation where Debbie Ngarewa-Paka is a minister, perhaps of associate Māori development or children or something like that.
Could be a minister outside government, actually, which is the innovation Labour did with the Greens.
Absolutely. And all of that's fine, but if you can't guarantee 2 or 3 votes in your caucus when it comes to confidence and supply, that's not much use. If you say, well, look, I, as the negotiator in these coalition talks, will support the government, but I can't really speak for my caucus because they each represent their own individual.
I think they would find their way around that. I think that sounds like a lot of optimism from potentially from those who hope that this will be.
Well, yeah, look, sure, but sometimes, especially within these small parties where there are rivalries, and I think we saw that with the original iteration of the Māori Party. There does become a little bit of a split between those who join the executive and become ministers outside cabinet and those who are
to bring down a government.
Enough to
prevent its formation.
Enough to reduce the size of the caucus that supports the government. Yes,
all right.
And we've seen that before.
All right, let's come back to something that's a little bit closer to action, and this is the mega strike coming this week. I'm conscious I've skipped over where Labour's at the moment, but suffice to say it's announcing very little. It's watching itself rise in the polls. Almost it seems as a protest vote, and at some point that has got to change, and we know we're expecting its decisions on CGT or wealth or whatever sometime before Christmas. At some point it's going to become a bigger target. But perhaps we talk, with time running out, about this week's mega strike. Government has been very much getting out on the front foot and saying, in the case of the Health Minister, questioning the ethics of the doctors going on strike, which didn't go down very well with them. The teachers being targeted. I think Judith Collins making comments about what their priorities were when they met with the Education Minister. Is that going to work with people? Ben, do you win when you criticise the doctors and expect people to back you over them?
To begin with, you might. Look, honestly, the Palestine meeting point
one, yeah.
is a great one. I mean,
to elaborate, I think that according to Judith Collins, that was number one on the list of issues that the teachers' union brought to a meeting. Am I getting that correct?
For an agenda for a meeting
right.
where they were not to discuss matters that were related to the collective bargaining. And I think the collective bargaining and the wish to discuss Palestine, quizzical as it might be, I think got conflated, perhaps elided the different distance between those
Right.
in the open letter from the government. This is a much more confrontational stance than I can remember, any government this century taking towards union action, I think. And, look, to say it's political, that the strikes are on the same day, well, of course it's political and it's strategic. It's very rare. You can't have general strikes or sympathetic strikes in New Zealand. And so it is very rare that the moons coincide and you get two large
You're all
unionised
bargaining at the same
workforces,
time.
able to strike at the same time. And they are taking full advantage of that. Between people who have to figure out what to do with their kids and people who have to figure out what to do with their medical appointments, that's going to impact on a lot of New Zealanders. And, the traditional maths
But
for
who
this
do they blame for it?
is that initially they blame the doctors and they blame the teachers, and then after it's been going on for a while, then they say, why is the government not fixing this? That's the cliche kind of way for it to pan out. And look, it's very hard to beat the teachers' unions. I was talking to somebody over the weekend who was telling me about a slip of paper that went into his child's backpack, explaining early childhood reforms, and he said he showed it to his neighbour. It's it's pretty hard to replicate that with an open letter.
I do remember when Helen Clark was Prime Minister, I don't know if you can confirm this, Andrew, but the then Education Minister, Trevor Mallard, happened to have a little trip overseas where his associate, Marion Hobbs, continued negotiating the deal. But, again, first, how serious is this for the government, Andrew? And then second, are they going to win any sympathy by going on the front foot like this? What's your take on how that's going to play out?
It's a highly aggressive approach, and I don't think I've ever seen anything in my memory of that that's this aggressive, coming out with an opinion piece that really sort of starts to stretch things a little bit. And the press release, what people didn't see in the papers with that op-ed was it was actually a press release from the minister that detailed a lot of facts underneath as well. So they're really laying it out. The problem comes back to I think the public will be in a bell curve. Some will be annoyed, some will be supporting the union members, and most people will kind of wait and see. The problem for the government comes back to my point about getting another 5% from the left. I don't think you do that by having this highly aggressive approach, attacking union members, saying it's all politically motivated and coordinated when the government has been coordinated and politically motivated on that. Coming back, two other points. Firstly, what would Jim Bolger have done in this situation? And he was Minister of Labour under Muldoon. Muldoon gave him the largest office in the building because he had to have all the union leaders in there to negotiate.
They were very different days, Andrew.
Very different days,
and different laws.
But my point is this: if this is this aggressive approach is some sort of almost Trumpian approach to get everyone off kilter, come out with a highly aggressive move, and then swoop in and make a deal at the last minute saying that you've saved the day, then good on them. Let's see that happen. When I was at Air New Zealand again in 2018, the aircraft engineers were going to strike at Christmas. They had voted to do so after protracted negotiations. Christopher Luxon got on the phone to Richard Wagstaff, and between them they managed to work with Air2 and sort that out. It would be amazing and great for the Prime Minister's personal ratings if he got on the phone and had a personal impact into making this, sorting this situation out. As Ben said, the longer this goes on, the more the public will start to blame the government.
The issue will be his finance minister, and again, that came down to what Bolger did. He overruled his own people, but it's a big call at the time where they are saying, "Hey, look, we're cutting the expenditure, we're cutting our cloth, we're getting the basics back."
Well, they're actually offering a rate that's under inflation. Inflation's 3%, and they're offering less than 2.5%.
Yeah.
So who's going to accept that?
And look, it's been, as the Prime Minister pointed out, he said, it's been lower in the private sector. But again, is that the story that you need to be telling? So
interesting, such an interesting week. Thank you both for being in. Ben Thomas, Andrew Kirton.